While history often highlights the Islamic golden age of science and culture, it frequently overlooks the fate of millions who resisted conversion amid the swift rise of Islamic Caliphates. The brutal practices of medieval Islamic empires toward subjugated peoples seem far harsher than European medieval warfare. The insights shared here come from historical records penned by Arab chroniclers, not just their adversaries. These actions were deliberate conquest policies that transformed the medieval landscape, erasing entire civilizations from memory. From the systematic abduction of children to form slave armies to the obliteration of ancient cultural identities, Islamic caliphates excelled in conquest methods well beyond mere military triumphs. They recognized that shattering the spirits of the conquered proved more effective than territorial occupation. The Ottoman Empire operated one of history's most organized child trafficking schemes, masked as a tax collection method. The devshirme, or blood tax, compelled Christian families in the Balkans to surrender their young sons to the Sultan. Every few years, Ottoman officials would raid Christian villages, selecting boys aged 8 to 18 based on their physical abilities and intelligence. Parents were left helpless, forced to watch their children taken away, often realizing they would never reunite. Resisting such seizure meant death for entire families. These boys were subsequently transported to Istanbul, forcibly converted to Islam, and subjected to rigorous military training aimed at erasing their past identities. They were prohibited from speaking their mother tongues, contacting relatives, or practicing their former faith. The most promising recruits became Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry division. The psychological indoctrination employed was both sophisticated and brutal. These boys were led to believe their Christian families had abandoned them, portraying the Sultan as their savior from ignorance. They were provided with new identities and loyalties, many genuinely believing they owed their existence to the very system that enslaved them. Historical accounts suggest that between 1365 and 1826, when the practice was ultimately halted, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million Christian boys were removed from their homes. Regions across the Balkans lived in a constant state of fear of the next collection. Ironically, these kidnapped children often became the key force used to annex more Christian territories. The cycle of conquest and conversion perpetuated itself, as former Christians were used to dismantle their own communities. The devshirme was not solely about producing soldiers. It sought to extinguish the spirit of Christian societies. Families developed desperate methods to protect their children. Some would intentionally injure their boys to render them unsuitable for selection, while others hid them away in secluded areas during collection times. However, the Ottoman system proved thorough, and few children avoided capture once identified. In contrast to the Atlantic slave trade, which lasted around 400 years, the Islamic slave trade persisted for over 1,400 years, from the 7th century well into the early 20th century. Conservative estimates indicate that between 11 to 17 million Africans were enslaved and transported to Islamic regions, yet the actual figure was likely even higher. The Islamic slave trade had one grim distinction compared to the Atlantic trade: systematic castration. Between 80 and 90% of male slaves destined for Islamic markets underwent castration, either prior to transport or upon arrival. The survival rate for those enduring this procedure was approximately 10%, marking it as virtually a death sentence. The Islamic world's castration centers operated on an industrial scale, with the primary facility in Aswan, Egypt, processing thousands of males and boys annually. Those who survived this procedure were rendered as eunuchs, marked as less than human and unable to reproduce. The rationale was not accidental, but a calculated policy. While Islamic law acknowledged slavery, it encouraged the emancipation of slaves, especially those converting to Islam. Preventing slaves from reproducing maintained a perpetual demand for new captives while avoiding complications from a substantial permanent slave population. female slaves encountered a similarly harsh reality. The most attractive were selected for harems and concubinage, while others labored domestically. Unlike in the Americas, where slave families could form and procreate, Islamic slavery aimed to prevent the emergence of stable slave communities. The Mamluk system exemplified this extreme. Young boys, primarily from the Caucasus and Central Asia, were bought as slaves, converted to Islam, and raised as elite fighters. Eventually, these Mamluks became powerful enough to overthrow their masters and govern Egypt and Syria for over 250 years. Yet they perpetuated the cycle by continuously importing new slave soldiers rather than permitting their offspring to inherit power. The economic toll was catastrophic for the source regions. Slave raids decimated entire areas of Africa. The constant warfare required to capture slaves crippled local economies and hindered growth. Many regions still struggle to recover from centuries of relentless human trafficking. Arab historical figures like al-Tabari and Ibn Battuta wrote matter-of-factly about slave markets and castration, treating these aspects as normal economic life. The scale and systematic nature of these operations were deemed unremarkable by contemporary Islamic scholars. The psychological ramifications on families and communities were profound. Islamic Caliphates devised sophisticated systems to eradicate other faiths while maintaining plausible deniability regarding forced conversions. The dhimmi system established legal frameworks that made non-conversion economically and socially unviable. The jizya, or poll tax on non-Muslims, was intentionally set at levels that would impoverish most families. In many cases, the tax equated to several months' income, making it unattainable for all but the most affluent. The collection process was deliberately humiliating. Dhimmis had to present themselves in public, often subjected to physical contempt while fulfilling their obligations. However, taxation represented only one tactic. The systematic obliteration of religious infrastructure played an equally crucial role. Following their conquest of Egypt in 641 AD, Arabs embarked on a prolonged campaign of demolishing Coptic monasteries and churches. These structures were more than mere buildings. They housed centers of knowledge that safeguarded the remnants of ancient Egyptian culture. Similar destruction was witnessed during the conquest of Persia, where Zoroastrian fire temples, some continuously burning for a millennium, were extinguished. Zoroastrian scriptures were destroyed, and priests faced execution or compulsion to convert. In mere centuries, a faith that had once dominated the Persian Empire for over 1,000 years was diminished to a small minority. Mahmud of Ghazni's campaigns in India from 1000 to 1027 AD may represent the most extensive destruction of a religion in history. His chroniclers boasted of demolishing over 50,000 Hindu temples, forcing millions to convert at sword point. The iconic Somnath Temple, one of Hinduism's holiest sites, was destroyed, with its remnants repurposed as steps for a mosque. This devastation wasn't merely random vandalism, it was calculated psychological warfare. By dismantling the physical symbols of other faiths, Islamic conquerors displayed the impotence of alternative deities, underscoring Islam's supremacy. Forced conversions frequently occurred amid the ruins of desecrated temples, reinforcing the narrative of Muslim dominance. Legal restrictions increasingly complicated the practice of other religions. Christians and Jews faced prohibitions against constructing new places of worship or ringing bells during services. They were denied the right to assemble publicly, testify against Muslims, bear weapons, or ride horses. These limitations created a system of legal apartheid, reducing non-Muslims to second-class citizens within their own lands. The cumulative repercussions were catastrophic. Entire ancient Christian communities in North Africa, which had once produced theologians like Augustine, vanished entirely. The Zoroastrian populace in Persia, once numbering in the millions, now stands at less than 200,000 worldwide. Complete religious traditions that had thrived for millennia were expunged from their homelands. The Islamic Caliphate established a system of sexual slavery on a scale incomparable to any other historical examples. The harem system was not solely about fulfilling rulers' desires. It served as a systematic method of subjugating conquered peoples through the sexual exploitation of their women. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, immortalized in the Arabian Nights, maintained a harem of over 2,000 women, capturing them from across the Islamic world. These women were treated as mere sexual property, often discarded as they aged or lost favor. When Baghdad fell to the Mongols in 1258, the last Abbasid caliph's harem contained more than 700 women. Contemporary accounts detail the systematic rape and murder of these women as the city succumbed to flames, marking the end of centuries of institutionalized sexual slavery in the Abbasid capital. The concubinage system established a legal framework for sexual exploitation. Concubines lacked rights and could be bought, sold, or transferred with ease. Their offspring were deemed illegitimate and granted no inheritance rights unless expressly recognized by their fathers. Slave markets across the Islamic realm catered to the sale of women for sexual purposes. Ibn Battuta's travel chronicles described markets in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad where women were displayed naked for inspection by potential buyers. The most desirable commanded prices equivalent to several years' worth of wages for skilled laborers. The psychological toll on families was severe. Parents lived in dread, knowing that attractive daughters faced the grim risk of being captured and sold into sexual servitude. Some families intentionally marred their daughters' features to diminish their appeal to raiders. Others confined their daughters indoors, fostering a culture of female seclusion that persists in some regions. This system created an insatiable demand for new captives. Unlike wives, who maintained their status throughout life, concubines were frequently replaced as they aged, resulting in slave raids that specifically targeted young women, wreaking havoc on the demographic structure of conquered lands. The magnitude of sexual slavery was astounding. The Ottoman Empire alone is estimated to have enslaved between 1 to 1.5 million women for sexual purposes from the 14th to 19th centuries. These women hailed from diverse backgrounds across the Balkans, Caucasus, Africa, and Central Asia. Islamic scripture provided a religious rationale for such practices, with Quranic verses concerning those whom your right hand possesses, interpreted to allow unlimited sexual access to female slaves. Religious scholars crafted intricate legal frameworks governing the buying, selling, and usage of sex slaves, while maintaining that the institution was divinely ordained. The ramifications for conquered communities were deep-rooted. The systematic removal of young women disrupted family structures and cultural heritage transmission. Many communities struggled to recover from the demographic devastation wrought by centuries of sexual slavery. Islamic caliphates honed economic warfare as a means of domination. The goal transcended mere extraction of wealth. It aimed to obliterate the economic foundation of conquered populations, engendering dependence on Islamic rulers. The Kharaj land tax enforced on subjugated regions was deliberately set at confiscatory levels, often consuming 50 to 80% of agricultural yield, leaving farmers with barely enough to subsist. When farmers defaulted, their lands were confiscated and redistributed to Muslim settlers or designated as waqf, religious endowments. The Umayyad conquest of Persia serves as a prime example of systematic economic devastation. The advanced irrigation systems that had sustained Persian agriculture for centuries were deliberately destroyed or allowed to deteriorate. This destruction was not a result of mere neglect, but rather a calculated effort to inhibit economic revival and foster dependence on Arab authority. Tribute demands often included quotas of people rather than only goods. The Nubians had to annually provide 400 slaves to the Fatimid Caliphate, while the Bulgars were obliged to supply young men for military service. These human tributes devastated local populations and ensured a steady stream of forced labor for the caliphates. Trade restrictions imposed economic apartheid. Non-Muslims were often prohibited from engaging in specific types of commerce or subjected to extra taxes on their business activities. Consequently, this gradually shifted economic control into Muslim hands and marginalized non-Muslim communities. The cumulative effect was the systematic impoverishment of conquered peoples. Prosperous regions rapidly declined into economic backwaters within generations of Islamic conquest. The intention was to render resistance financially unfeasible while creating incentives for conversion to Islam. Islamic Caliphates did not merely conquer lands, they actively obliterated the cultures and identities of subjugated peoples. This cultural genocide progressed so systematically that entire civilizations vanished from collective historical memory. The deliberate destruction of libraries and educational centers was widespread. The conquest of Alexandria resulted in the dismantlement of what remained of its renowned library, once a beacon of ancient knowledge. Similar destruction occurred in Ctesiphon, the Ctesiphonic capital, where royal libraries filled with centuries of accumulated wisdom were set ablaze. Language suppression served as another critical instrument of cultural annihilation. Arabic was imposed as the official language of administration, education, and religion throughout conquered lands. Local dialects were incrementally sidelined and ultimately forgotten. Coptic, the last vestige of ancient Egyptian, only survived in religious contexts before ultimately disappearing from daily use. The renaming of cities and geographical features constituted a systematic effort to erase pre-Islamic history. Names with millennia of heritage were replaced with Arabic alternatives, not merely for administrative convenience, but as a calculated historical erasure. Religious celebrations and cultural practices faced similar suppression. The Persian New Year celebration of Nowruz was often outlawed, as were Hindu festivals in conquered Indian territories. Local customs that had characterized communities for centuries were labeled non-Islamic and eradicated outright. The demolition of monuments and architectural heritage also followed a systematic approach. Pre-Islamic temples and palaces were either destroyed or repurposed into mosques. The implication was unmistakable. The past held no value, and only Islamic culture mattered. Educational systems underwent comprehensive restructuring. Traditional institutions responsible for imparting local knowledge and culture were dismantled or converted into madrasas, focusing solely on Islamic teachings. This obliteration severed the chain of cultural transmission, ensuring that younger generations remained oblivious to their heritage. The ramifications were both severe and lasting. Ancient Egyptian civilization, which had enduringly survived multiple conquests, was entirely eradicated within a few centuries post-Arab invasion. Zoroastrian Persia, once rich in literary and philosophical contributions, dwindled to a mere fraction of its former self. The scale of cultural destruction was so profound that modern archaeological discoveries frequently uncover remnants of sophisticated civilizations previously unknown, annihilated, and forgotten. Entire chapters of human history were expunged during the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate, which instituted one of history's most effective systems of conquest and cultural obliteration. Their methodologies were so adept at erasing civilizations that entire identities dissolved from public consciousness, leaving merely archaeological vestiges and isolated references in surviving texts. The magnitude of destruction is unparalleled. Millions enslaved, eliminated, or compelled to renounce their cultures and identities. Ancient cultures that endured numerous invasions were irreversibly lost within a few centuries of Islamic expansion. The systematic nature of these actions affirms they were not mere collisions of violence or cultural misunderstandings. These were calculated policies aimed at quelling the spirit of subjugated peoples, rendering resistance virtually impossible. The intersection of military conquest, economic warfare, cultural obliteration, and systemic enslavement synthesized into a comprehensive domination strategy. Comprehending these historical practices sheds light on patterns of cultural destruction that continue in contemporary society. Though methodologies may evolve, the objective persists: to eradicate alternative lifestyles and impose a singular dominant culture.